Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. Peace be upon you all. Welcome to another live show with us on Talk to East Turkestan. Today, I have an important guest, Dr. Anders Corr, publisher of the Journal of Political Risk and founder of Corr Analytics, which provides strategic analysis of international politics. Welcome, Anders. How are you today?
Thanks. Great to meet you.
Great. Dr. Anders Corr is joining us all the way from the UK, and he's going to provide, today we're basically going to be talking about a few issues. First issue on the cards today is the Uyghur Bill that has been enacted into law today. We're going to be talking about that. We're obviously going to be talking about the India-China border battle that's been going on, and a few other issues relating to the Uyghurs of East Turkestan. So let's get right to the chase. Let's start off with the Uyghur Bill. What does this Uyghur Bill, this law now, what does it mean for the Uyghurs?
Well, I think it's a really huge achievement. Dr. Rabia Kadir, long ago in about 2005, 2006, is the first person I know that proposed the bill in a speech that she made to Congress. And she called it back then the Uyghur Policy Act, and it's turned into, over time, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. And there have been many sponsors of the bill in the Congress over time that where it started, it stopped. Finally, I think Marco Rubio has really pushed this bill along with the Nuri Turkle at the UHRP and Omar Kazat. And so I think that all those guys get a lot of credit for what they've done. And then it went to, of course, McConnell, who sat on it for a long time. I think everyone was wondering, like, why isn't action being taken on this? Because it's been around, I think, longer than the Hong Kong Human Rights Bill. McConnell, it was unclear why he wasn't bringing it for action when it clearly had the support in both houses for passage. So once he signed it, of course, it went to the president, and the president signed it. And it is interesting that, the media is making a lot of the fact that it was signed essentially at the same time as Bolton's book came out, and the excerpt came out where he said, reportedly, according to Bolton, allegedly, President Trump said it's just fine to, have the concentration camps, and it's unclear. Bolton clearly has a negative attitude towards President Trump. It seems to me from reading the excerpt that there's a bit of he's selected bad things to say about President Trump. So we don't really know exactly, I think, what President Trump's opinions are on this. It is clear that President Trump, in terms of human rights, it's not ideologically, he does not put human rights ahead of U.S. interests. And, his ideology is America first. So he's not, which is different. I believe that part of what makes America is democracy and human rights. Okay, so I don't think there's a contradiction between putting America first and human rights. But what Trump thinks exactly is unclear. But he's been pushing, obviously, the trade deal with China. There's a possibility that he was using the Uyghur Bill as a bargaining chip, not to, put the Uyghur Bill through if he could get a good trade deal. I don't know that. It's speculation, and then once the Bolton book, it was clear that Bolton was writing this book. He had to, it's likely that the U.S. government found out about that book, obviously. There is a pre-publication review process that people with security clearances have to go through with their writing. If they're writing about things that are possibly classified. It's not entirely clear to what extent he went through that process. I'm not sure. But it is also possible that, President Trump signed the Uyghur Bill at the time at this time in order to distract attention from Bolton's book. I don't know whether that's true or not, but there is speculation on that. It's hard to know about timing of this whole thing.
Yeah, because as far as I saw, the Washington Post article came out about the book, and then the Uyghur bill, the news of that came through, and then we see this tweet where Donald Trump basically, puts down John Bolton, saying he's a wacko, is full of lies and fake stories. What's the issue between these two guys?
I can't say that I know, actually. Apparently there were some policy disagreements, and President Trump is the boss. If you work for him, you have to do what he says and support him. I think he places very high value in terms of loyalty of people who work for him. So, he would never hire a never Trumper, for example. If you feel disloyal to him, if he feels that you're disloyal, he kicks you out. So that's his leadership style. And, for whatever reason, Bolton was out, and a lot of people have been fired by Trump. He's famous for that. So, it's his style, and I'm not exactly sure why Bolton got let go. But.
Yeah. Do you think there will be actual change from this bill? I mean, we've seen a similar bill for Tibet, for Hong Kong, even the Taipei Act for Taiwan. Are there going to be real ramifications against China? Where do you see this? Will there be any practical things happening against China, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a very important bill. First of all, just to get this passed with such a massive majority in Congress really sends a message to China. They're not pulling all the strings in the U.S. Congress, despite all of their corporate friends and all those corporate friends' donations to congressional members. But we will look in the future, and we're already seeing the Commission on Religious Human Rights, of which Nuri Turkle has just been added to as a commissioner. Have already seen that they have made a statement calling on rapid enactment of the measures in that bill. So that would mean very quick sanctions on Chen Guangguo. I don't know if I pronounced his name correctly, but rapid sanctions on him and others involved in the camps, and then also a quick assessment by perhaps the FBI about what kind of measures China is using to impose their will on the Uyghur community in the United States, whether that is influence attempts or threats of retribution against family members back in China. So I do expect to see some pretty quick action on some of this. I don't think that Trump is going to stand in the way of that. There's no indication of that. Trump has given the Justice Department, the State Department, a lot of free rein once they to address human rights issues. So I think we do see. I think we will see some of some quick action on some of this. I hope so.
Now, one of the questions that one of our followers had was, could we see another bill calling for an independent Uyghur or East Turkestan, similar to one that's being pushed forth by Congressman Scott Perry, asking the President of the United States to recognize the Tibetan Autonomous Region as an independent country from China? Could we see something, or could we even see this actually happening, the Tibetan one? And could we see a push for an Uyghur one, do you think?
I think it's possible. As things get more clear to American politicians, that China is a real danger. And I think that's happening now. Even just now we've seen in the India situation, you had at least 23 Indian soldiers just brutally murdered by the Chinese government, and I mean the PLA forces there in what I think was a surprise attack, essentially. And if you've seen the photos that have been around and published on mainstream media of the metal rods that have had nails welded onto them as kind of huge maces or something. I mean, it's very medieval. What kind of things? And there are also reports from Indian media that it wasn't just that. They could have been using swords and spears. I don't know if that's true, but I've seen reports in some Indian media that it wasn't just the mace. So as this becomes clear and we see repeated time after time Xi Jinping doing things that are just it's just unspeakable what he's doing. I think that it's going to be hard for Americans not to take a stronger position against what China is doing, and that might include increasing support for these kinds of what I think a couple of years ago would seem to be a very radical position, which would be independence for Tibet or independence for East Turkestan. And there's a lot of danger with that kind of approach too. I mean, it's intuitively we want East Turkestan to be independent. We want Tibet to be independent, Hong Kong to be independent. Taiwan is kind of independent already, but it still has a fight to go through. And there's a lot of worry that if it were to declare independence, even though it is de facto independence, if it were to declare independence, that it would invite an attack from Beijing. So, when Tibet had its independence struggle in the early 1950s, and that was supported by the CIA. I mean, over 1 million people died. It can be an excuse for the PLA to kill a lot of people. So it's a tough call about what's best for the Uyghurs, what's best for the Tibetans. If these independence acts are the right call. I certainly would love to see East Turkestan independent. I would love to see Tibet and Hong Kong independent. I'd like to see the whole country independent from the Chinese Communist Party. But there are also tactical decisions that you have to make and think about in terms of consequences. I think the nonviolent action outside of the country, to bring the CCP down is definitely a promising approach. Economic sanctions on the CCP, until they make serious improvements on democracy and human rights, I think is a very strong approach. Because a call for independence, while morally correct, may not be as powerful as, for example, de-linking economically from China. And conditioning relinking with China on real human rights and real democracy steps forward. So it's a very tough call, but I think it's possible. I mean, you see the bill in Congress, and I think it's possible.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, the border issue has been escalating for a while, and the footage that you were talking about, it's quite interesting that they only came out with batons and rods and iron rods and the amount of people that had died. Do you believe those figures? And China, some of the Indian media are saying that 43 PLA had died. Is there any truth to this, or do you know of any other information? I believe you're writing about this issue. What have you found from this?
I am writing about it, and I do certainly believe the 20 to 23 dead on the Indian side. And my information is that there was then a counterattack by the Indians against the Chinese. and that the Chinese were then surprised that night. And I'm trying to confirm this. I've really got this only from a couple sources. There are a couple of Indian news outlets that are talking about this. And I think what we will see is, I think we'll see more of this information come out in the future, because India is quite an open society, and they talk about their politics. So, and there's a lot of, there's two parties there, and they're in contest with each other. So that leads to a situation where there's a lot more transparency in terms of information than we might get from China. But I do think there is a strong possibility that quite a few Chinese were killed as well in retaliation for what happened.
Obviously, China played a big, they probably said in their own media that, they're controlling the situation, and Xi Jinping has called out for, a war on the border. Now, you've touched upon this a moment ago about the independence of, say, Tibet or Hong Kong, possibly Hong Kong or even Taiwan. What's the US's stance, or where do you see this going? Does the US want to basically cut up China into little pieces, or do they just want to get rid of the Communist Party and put a democratic system in?
Well, I think the U.S., if you look at the history of U.S. diplomacy with China, it's actually, the biggest, I think, priority for the U.S. has always been trade with China.
Yeah.
And you can see that going all the way back to 1949 and before, where the U.S. was in competition for markets with China, even before 1949, when after the communists had taken over Beijing, but you didn't have recognition of Beijing, of the CCP as the government by countries like the UK and the US yet. But then, in order to maximize their trade potential and the assets they had on the ground, the UK fell over themselves to basically lead recognition of the CCP in 1949. Since then, it's a competition between different governments and different big corporations that are trying to do business in China because it's such a big market. I mean, for the U.S., it's $600 billion worth of trade every year. It has been until the tariffs and things cut that down a bit. But even though we have a trade deficit with China of a couple $100 billion, it still is this massive cash cow for big U.S. corporations. And what I suspect is that the biggest Wall Street banks are leading in terms of how much profit they get from China. And it's not necessarily legitimate profit, because China can turn up the profit or turn down the profit. They have such control over the economy, they can turn the profit up or down at will. So, these banks are probably making quite a bit of money, a very big return on investment. And because they're making so much money in China, they pressure the US government to keep an even keel with China politically, to ignore human rights issues, essentially. And so this is what you've seen going back from 1972, when Nixon opened to China, all the way to the present, I believe. And even Trump is prioritizing trade over other issues like Uyghurs, Tibet, Hong Kong, South China Sea, Japan. China's constantly making incursions over Japanese jets, airspace, where the Japanese have to send fighter jets all the time to meet these incoming Chinese and Russian fighter jets. And we just don't hear about that in the media. We don't, it's not made a priority. What we hear about a lot in terms of bargaining is trade, American trade. We want more trade. We want IP protections. We want cybersecurity protections for our corporations. And it's primarily our corporations that have a lot of influence on our U.S. foreign policy and U.S. policies in general, whether we're under a Democrat or a Republican administration. So, does the U.S. want to cut up China into many parts, or do they just want the CCP to fall? I would say neither, really. Really what's happening is the U.S. government wants trade with China. And And if you look at the fact that it took so long for us, from 2005 or 6, I mean, that's 15 years since Rabia Kadir first proposed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. We can't even get that after, we barely got that after 15 years. And the timing of it appears that it might have been in retaliation for Xi Jinping not providing the U.S. with trade concessions, right? I mean, if we believe Bolton, President Trump was asking for more agricultural goods sold in states that he needs, swing states that he needs in the election. I don't know if that's true, but it's a pretty damning assessment of Trump if it is. And it's not only Trump, though. I believe that it goes very deeply into our system, where because we are such a free society, we allow our corporations the freedom to decide who they trade with. That includes internationally. And because we allow that, it's very easy for a country like China, who's extremely sophisticated politically, economically, and in terms of their international strategy, it allows them to leverage in an incredibly fine-tuned way the U.S. political system, because they know that our U.S. politicians are responding to electoral incentives and monetary incentives for campaign donations, and they know that Americans vote based on their stomach and their wallet. So, there's an argument here for more control of who sells to China, right? For other countries that aren't quite as sophisticated as China, or don't try to use economic leverage quite as boldly as China, we don't have to worry about it as much, and we can allow our corporations to freely sell to whomever they want, wherever they get the best price. But with China, because they're sophisticated, we may have to put more controls in. So now the tariffs are one way to put the controls in. Okay, we are now cranking down on trade with China through tariffs in order to leverage them back. They're trying to leverage us. We can leverage them back with the tariffs. We may see, and we also have CFIUS, which is a way in which the U.S. government controls which corporations can sell themselves, can sell controlling numbers of shares, for example, or even more, to a Chinese entity. And if, for example, a corporation has proprietary technology that could be used by China's military, we don't let them sell to China. Right? So we could actually put more controls like that on all of trade to China. It's been done, frequently. We used to, in the U.S. and its allies during the Cold War, used to have something that basically was much more controlling in terms of exports of strategic goods. And back then it was aluminum, rubber, oil and gas, things that could be used by the military, steel. We can actually do that again, and I think we should bring back some of those controls on exports to China.
So, from your answer, I'm gathering that the Hong Kong issue, Tibetans, Taiwan, East Turkestan, Chinese Christians, all these issues are basically a poker chip against China to basically make that extra 5-10% in trade deals. This is what I'm gathering from your answer, sort of.
Unfortunately, it's hard to tell, but human rights has really been on the back burner for the United States for too long, and it's absolutely a huge problem. And I don't really think Americans are aware of this. But if you really look at, what are the bargaining points? What do U.S. ambassadors in China spend their time doing? Do they spend their time talking to Uyghurs, Hong Kong, human rights people, or do they spend their time talking to big CEOs of corporations to try to get them more trade deals in China? And I am guessing, I think, from my sense, is that they spend much more time with CEOs than they do with human rights activists.
I guess that's the fear. I mean, many have argued that because of COVID-19, the sort of the human rights issues have been sped up by 20, 30 years. I mean, when you're talking about the Uyghur Rights Bill, as you mentioned, it was introduced well over 10 years ago, but it's only just been signed. That the fear is once this virus is over, or what recently Trump has called he's got a new name for it now, the Chinese plague. Once this is all over, it looks like it's going to be back to business with China and trade deals. And do you see this happening, or are you thinking no, we're gonna see it change up, more human rights, or back to trade?
Well, I hope we see more human rights. I mean, I think that as Americans feel more threatened by China, I think that we will see more of a focus on non-trade items. And there's a big book coming out, actually. Clive Hamilton and a German co-author, Marieke Olberg, I think, is publishing a book yesterday. Actually, it's already published in Australia, about Chinese influence operations. So in addition to the military threat, which is more televisable and more obvious to people, the threat of China capturing our elites through donations, high returns on investment to corporations, I think is possibly even more dangerous to us. And as Americans figure this out, I believe that they will start to insist on their government taking have less of a focus on trade and more of a focus on human rights and democratic reform in China. We can't just have openness be the goal with China, because openness is kind of a code word for more U.S. sale of goods to China. That really shouldn't be the demand. Some people would interpret openness to be political openness, but it's not really. I mean, what it means in actuality, when it gets right down to it, is more sales of American goods to China. What we should be demanding is democratic reform in China, human rights improvements in China. I mean, that's what Americans, that's what should matter to American voters, just from a moral or ethical perspective, in terms of closing the concentration camps, and creating some space for Hong Kongers to have their free speech and political rights. I mean, so I would hope that over the coming years, as China becomes more powerful and more aggressive, right? Because they're becoming more powerful, they're becoming more aggressive, and it's becoming more obvious what kind of a regime the Chinese Communist Party is to Americans who haven't been paying attention. So, Beijing is closer today than it was to Washington, D.C., than it was 10 years ago in terms of Americans' perception, because they see the influence and they see the threat.
Well, we have heard that there is some sort of internal conflict happening within the CCP, and perhaps internally people wanting to take down Xi Jinping. Have you heard anything like this? What are your thoughts on this matter?
Well, there is some of that. There are some indicators. For example, one of the first indicators that we saw was the conflict between the foreign ministry spokesman and the U.S., the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. And they had a little public dispute. It's possible that this is just a show, because one thing that will stop us from taking stronger action against China is if we believe there's a liberal wing and a hardline wing in Beijing politics. And we've seen the same kind of tactic used by Iran, where they say that there's hardliners and pro-liberal group. And, if we just go soft on Iran, then that will help the liberal group. And if we go hard on Iran, then that'll help the hardliner group. So that's an argument against us being tough on Iran. And the same applies to Beijing, where they're trying to use this supposed split between the hardliners and the liberals in Beijing to get us to go soft on China, so that supposedly the liberal wing wins out. But the reality is Xi Jinping has a very tight grip on power in Beijing. He's gotten rid of his opposition through the corruption drive, the supposed corruption drive. And, I don't see any indications that he is at all under threat, really. I mean, I would be interested to hear what you think are the biggest indications of this. There was some. There was a question, I think, before. I would be interested in what you have to say on this.
There is many talk. Perhaps, yeah, I have heard of this, where, as you mentioned, they want to give the CCP the outside world a sort of, well, even though we're communists, we do have a sort of democratic feel within us. There are people that don't necessarily worship Xi Jinping, which is generally, that's the narrative based on what we've seen from, say, the leaked documents coming out from these concentration camps. Yeah, so that's what I think about that. So from what I gather with the Uyghur bill, it's not necessarily, say Trump or the US fully support the Uyghurs in their rights or concentration camps. That's not number one. It's essentially a poker chip. I got a question here basically saying, and I guess this would answer it correctly or not, does the US actually have any strategic interest in Uyghur land, East Turkestan or Uyghurstan, so that Uyghurs can further their cause? Or is it just the Uyghur bill is just for show, basically? This is what I gather. The question here.
I definitely think, all else equal, that the U.S. would like, Xinjiang to be a separate country, or East Turkestan to be a separate country, Tibet to be a separate country, Hong Kong to be a separate country potentially. But it would, I believe that it would entail a fight, a physical, essentially almost a war to achieve that.
Yeah.
And I doubt that the U.S. is. I don't think the U.S. is ready to fight such a war. It would, and it's very hard for the people within those regions to break off, because the CCP has so much control, and that control is only increasing because now they have biometrics where they know exactly who everyone is. They're taking blood samples from all the males, and they've got, everyone's using their smartphones, and so they know where everyone is all the time. They've got, they can surveil everyone's communications. This is in the 1950s, and even in the 1950s, the CCP killed 1 million people to end the Tibet, CIA-supported Tibet breakoff. So I think that, hoping for some kind of an independence movement, while morally correct and ethically correct, I think is not tactically the right move. I think the tactical move is to pressure U.S. politicians, European politicians who supposedly are supposed to support democracy and human rights, and really pressure them, to take a stand on China, to take a stronger stand on China. But there's also, the need to get them to do that in a way. You really have to get rid of the influence of corporate money in politics, because it's that corporate money that's influencing our foreign policy and European foreign policy more than is the voters' voice. And the corporate money in politics, there are a lot of people who don't like the effect of corporate money in politics. Whether it's, the unions, of course, are also got their money in politics. So they have there's not going to be much help from the unions, but for example, environmentalists, I think, understand that there's a lot of corporate influence in politics, and they should be a potential ally of Uyghurs and Tibetans and Hong Kongers in terms of encouraging us to get rid of that money, because that influence flows from Beijing through the corporations to U.S. politicians, and it's going to make it very difficult to use U.S. power against Beijing. It's only going to be, what we're seeing right now is the use of U.S. power to serve, to get more trade for U.S. corporations, because they're the ones with the influence.
Well, off that, with those companies, with those corporations, we know that a few months ago, there was an article published by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute talking about those 83 global brands that were directly or indirectly involved in the Uyghur slave trade, where the Uyghurs are now supposedly out of these concentration camps, now being put into forced labor, churning out our Nike shoes, our Adidas tops, many other G&E, H&M. Do you see this changing, or what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, one option, of course, would be to go to the Black Lives Matter movement and try to get them to think about some of the issues in China, because you really have, the Black Lives Matter movement is talking about, for example, the effect of slavery in the United States, the long-term effect on structural racism and institutional racism, right? But officially, slavery is over in the U.S., but it's really going on still in China. And so I think that, if Uyghur activists could approach the Black Lives Matter movement and say, hey, can we get as a plank in your movement, can we start talking about Uyghurs who are in forced concentration camps, forced labor camps? Can we start discussing this as part of the BLM movement? I think, maybe that would educate the Democrats and the left in the United States to make this more of an issue. Sadly, the left, has taken often takes a friendly attitude towards China, maybe because China's supposedly socialist. And, there's a lot of Democrats, the Bernie supporters, who consider themselves socialist. So they wrongly somehow see a confluence of interests or a confluence of goals with China when it really should be exactly the opposite. I mean, China's like the world's biggest and most powerful and most violent corporation. It's controlled from the top. It's not like Swedish socialism. It's an incredibly dangerous form of authoritarian capitalism. And I think that the Democratic Party needs to be educated on that, needs to start thinking more in those terms. Bernie supporters, who are largely ideological and, they theoretically, they support human rights, but they need to be brought in. They need to be encouraged to really take a global view and think about, okay, well, which people in the world have the worst human rights? Well, it's the Uyghurs, and it's the Rohingya, and it's people in Syria who are being bombed by Russia and Assad. And it's, there are people, these are the people who really, have the worst human rights globally. I think there's actual slavery in Brazil still to some extent. I mean, there's a lot of people there who are, acting under slave-like conditions. But, the truly poor around the world and the really, truly repressed around the world are being, I would argue, largely ignored by the Democrats, Bernie supporters, the Black Lives Matter movement, all of whom should be, I think, taking a more global view and really thinking about other ethnicities and identities beyond American borders and beyond European borders that are under the knife, literally. I mean, Falun Gong is having their organs, taken and stolen from them and resulting in their death, according to a London tribunal. And there's just very little talk about that among among mainstream Democrats or Bernie supporters. Where's the ethics there?
It's very interesting. I've got a comment here. Black Lives Matter. People get mad when you say all lives matter. Or I've been recently posting Uyghur Lives Matter, and it seems to be, no, you stay off our case. We're only talking about Black lives. And with that, obviously, we have a very sensible question that obviously terrorism is not the answer. And we've seen that, many on the right commenting initially when Black Lives Matter or when George Floyd's issue came about, there was a lot of looting and a lot of people on the right called it domestic terrorism. But in the end, because of that violence, they kind of got what they wanted, didn't they? They kind of got the recognition. So the question here is terrorism, or what we saw on American streets, justified?
Well, no, it's not.
Yeah.
In a democracy, terrorism, violence is not a good way to go. Definitely. I mean, the Uyghurs, if the Uyghurs try any sort of violent tactics, they will all be thrown off into, whatever Uyghurs are left in the West, they're going to be thrown into Guantanamo. I mean, it's not going to be good for Uyghurs if they do that. I would argue that the Black Lives Matter movement is really shooting themselves in the foot. They're destroying their own cause by allowing and looking the other way where you have violence. The Antifa group, is and looters, and these things have now taken over. And Republicans are looking at this and saying, "I have nothing. We have nothing to do with this. This is obviously a domestic terrorist group. It all needs to be shut down as quickly as possible." Right. So what you're looking at is potential heavy repression, government repression coming down on not only the violent protesters and looters and vandals, but the rest of the movement. So it's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. It's very short-sighted. It's illegal. People, in democracies, people really shouldn't do things that are illegal because we have a vote. If you don't like a law, you should, vote to change that law. You shouldn't, take the law into your own hands, right? We do have a tradition of nonviolent protest, and of course that is a right that we all have in the U.S. to peaceably assemble. In Europe, people have the rights to protest, and I think that those protests and that right should be used responsibly. So, for example, during a pandemic, I think it's very irresponsible to get into big crowds of people and protest, right? You can protest online. You can have your opinion. You can write things online. You could do a social media campaign. You could do boycott campaigns. There are many things you can do that aren't going to endanger the lives of the people around you, which is what you're doing when you go to a physical protest. So in my opinion, it's unconscionable, even to go to these huge protests where obviously there's very little social distancing right now. And I also think, and I mean, that's not a popular opinion. No one wants to criticize the protests because they get in trouble for that. But the other thing is that the looting, and I've written an article for National Interest on how bad this looting and violence is for the movement. It's just it's making them look very bad. So the Uyghurs, the Uyghur approach is much better, which is it's a legal approach. They're trying to get legal reforms done. They've worked very hard and very nonviolently through the legal process since 2005, 2006 to get this bill through. They've finally gotten it through. And it's a huge success for everybody, right? And now you have Nuri Turkel, who's a commissioner for the religious commission, and he can now go ahead and promote enforcement of the new act from his position as a commissioner. So this is it's what's happening, and that strategy that the UHRP, Uyghur Human Rights Project, is doing is, I think, exactly right. And I've really thrown my support behind them because as far as I can tell, they are the ones who are getting the ball through the wicket. I mean, they are getting the ball down the field in a way that some other loudmouths aren't doing, right? So that's why I've thrown my support behind them, because I think I can see who's actually making the change.
I love how you used a cricket reference instead of a baseball one. Based on that, what's the next move for Uyghurs? What can layman Uyghur people do now to sort of further the Uyghur cause? We've got this bill through. What's next, do you think? Or what would you advise for Uyghur people, activists, organizations to do now? I think a lot of Uyghurs will know better than I do what they can do and where they have opportunities to do something.
I think that the Hong Kong movement, in terms of the nonviolent aspects of it, is a very good. What they're doing, I think, is has been very effective. They really have a huge social media presence that the Uyghurs don't have. I would like to see, every Uyghur out there get a Twitter account. The Hong Kongers had a follow back campaign where they all followed each other back, which increased all of their followers, right? And I think the Uyghurs should do this. I think that there should be I'm very impressed with, as I've said, with UHRP's Uyghur Human Rights Project's approach to things. I'm open to criticism of them if I hear it, but as far as I can tell, they've had a very good strategy. So I think throwing some support behind them, seeking some leadership, some combined action. But at the same time, I think it's smart to have people that are on the outside of that, who are smartly critical where criticism needs to happen. I think some of the criticism has been very unwarranted and possibly self-destructive for the Uyghur cause. But I think that others, I think there should be some room for debate among Uyghurs about what the best approach is to do. But I think massive social media campaigns, I think attempts to reach out to other organizations and groups and social movements that have a lot of followers, like Black Lives Matter, and see if you can get your plank in there. Reaching out to other, the U.S. is the first now government who's passed such a human rights law for the Uyghurs. I think, now let's go to the EU, let's go to Britain, let's go to France and say, hey, why can't you guys pass such a law, right? And do it quickly, because we don't have a lot of time. I mean, it's just astonishing that this is being allowed. And then the other thing I think would be to try to combine efforts with the Rohingya, because the Rohingya are in a similar situation. There's at least 3 concentration camps in Rakhine State, one of which was built by the Chinese. And now there's also an offshore concentration camp, essentially, or IDP. I mean, they call them internally displaced person camps, but really these are camps. They have guards. The Rohingya are not allowed out. And then, of course, there are all the huge camp, the 1.2 million Rohingya who are in IDP camps or refugee camps in Bangladesh, and who've had to flee to Saudi Arabia and Malaysia. So, the Rohingya movement is really, the way I see it is that the Rohingyas and the Uyghurs should get together and they should really advocate for each other. And try to, because it's all part of the same problem. It's this attempt to get rid of an ethnic minority from a larger political body, and the fact that it's being allowed to happen. And I think that the Chinese probably have a hand in what's happening to the Rohingya. Certainly, they've sold weapons to the Myanmar government. They have a lot of influence with the Myanmar government because the Chinese are selling weapons also to the internal, really terrorist groups within Myanmar. China's selling massive amounts of weapons, and I have a big article about this in Likas News.
That's what I want to ask you about. Does China have an influence in what's happening in Myanmar, and
absolutely.
Why? Yeah,
they have a huge influence because they've Myanmar has become a pariah state because of what they've done to the Rohingya. So they have difficulty operating around the world and selling their goods around the world. But China buys from them. China is purchasing oil and gas from their offshore fields, oil and gas fields, and shipping oil across the country in pipelines. They've got a gas and oil pipeline across Myanmar. They're selling a lot of goods to China. China, in turn, is selling a lot of weapons to Myanmar. There's a huge drug trade that probably has links into Chinese intelligence. So there's according to my sources. So it's they have a lot of influence there, and they're clearly not doing the Rohingya any favors by pressuring the Myanmar government to treat them in a humane way. I think it's probably just the opposite. And then China steps in and they take a contract to build an IDP camp, which is essentially another concentration camp on the smoking ruins of a Rohingya village. And this is documented, by there's an academic who Uyghurs should follow named Mohsin Habib. He's at Swinburne Technology University in Australia, and he's really done a lot of work to show, tens of thousands of murders of the Rohingya, tens of thousands of rapes of the Rohingya, which is what they did. And then they burnt the villages to send out 1.2 million refugees out of the country. And then they took over all that space. It's really another genocide. I mean, I call the Uyghur situation a genocide, and it's very clear from the UN definition of genocide in the convention that this term genocide applies both to the Uyghurs and the Rohingya, and the world is not doing enough about it. And so Uyghurs and Rohingya, I think, should try to combine up and demand that European countries and the U.S. really do something and do much more about this.
Final question. I'm not sure. We have a conversation within the Uyghurs where there is this struggle between names or ideologies between East Turkestan and Uyghuristan or Uyghustan. You don't have to answer the question, but one, are you aware of this? I'll ask that first.
Well, I actually have an opinion on this, and that is that
because people, this conversation is really debating within Uyghur circles, and it's interesting to get your take on this as a sort of outsider. Yeah, please.
I mean, I've written a bit on this, and I've written in Yuka News, I've written some stuff about the Uyghurs, and I do take a position on this, and that is that I think that East Turkestan has more than just Uyghurs in it, and it shouldn't be called Uyghuristan, which excludes everyone else. And I've actually taken an even more controversial position for Uyghurs, many of whom don't like this, but I think that the Chinese who have moved into the north, right? Who Uyghurs see as colonizers, right? I believe that they should be left alone. If you ever get an independent East Turkestan, which I support and which I think is a very long shot, I really strongly believe that once people move in a place, you shouldn't try to kick them out. When what you see with, for example, Pakistan and India, when there was a division of that country, and all the Muslims were sent north, and all the Hindus had to come south. It occasioned a lot of violence and a lot of negative things. And I think that the peaceful approach and the reasonable approach is when you think about starting a new nation, and also to decrease the opposition to such a new nation, you have to say everyone who's there is going to be equal. Okay. And just because we're Uyghurs doesn't mean we're going to be number one in this new state. And if you look at Israel, it's the same situation. Israel created a new state, and they were coming from a genocide of their own, and they were so angry about this that they put Jewish people first. And so what happened? All the Palestinians were horribly treated, and they're still being horribly treated. Now, if there had been a principle of total equality between Muslims and Jewish people in Israel from the beginning, and it had been more reasonable, I think that, and people were guaranteed to keep their homes, I think it would have been a better situation in Israel. And I think that, people who want to create an East Turkestan should think about that and think about those examples and not creating opposition. to their project by somehow putting Uyghurs up above everyone else in the East Turkestan region.
Yeah, it's very true.
I know that's controversial, and most of your viewers will disagree with me, but that's what I think. So
no, that's fine. I wanted your take on it. I'm sure these last 5 minutes, people are going to cut it up and interpret it in their own ways. What you just said, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I hope to have many more with you. As I mentioned to my viewers, we do have essentially a professional, someone in strategic analysis of international politics. Before we leave you, is there anything else that you wanted to mention, or
No, I just appreciate what you're doing, and I know that you've had some amazing guests on this show, and I just encourage you to keep going, keep being your independent self and thinking for yourself. And that goes for you and the rest of the Uyghurs who are struggling during this difficult time, and I support you guys 100%.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Anders, so much for this. I want to thank all the viewers for joining us today. Thank you, Anders. I hope to have you back again. Make sure you guys like, subscribe, and share this video. Get it out to friends and family. Thank you so much. And until next time, Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you all. Bye.
All right. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Alaikum salam.